The story begins with a boy born into a noble family in medieval France. From the moment of his birth, he was considered weak and cursed. An old alchemist prophesied that the boy would bring destruction to the world, urging his family to kill him. However, his grandfather refused to believe in such predictions, vowing to turn the boy into a hero. Despite his grandfather's hopes, the boy grew up obsessed with alchemy, neglecting his knightly studies while France remained at war with England for over 80 years. One day, Mon was at the library, borrowing a book about alchemy from an old man he called his teacher. Instead of training in swordsmanship, the boy immersed himself in alchemical books. During class, his friends wondered why Mon was skipping lessons again. Rich, one of his closest friends, confronted him about his poor grades and lack of discipline. However, with great enthusiasm, Mon explained that studying alchemy could save the nation from war. While they were in the school cafeteria, Rich scolded him for wasting time on fantasies, but the boy passionately explained his belief that creating the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary artifact capable of granting immortality, could end the war and save lives. Despite her skepticism, Rich tolerated his eccentricity. That night, Mon invited Rich to go somewhere. When night fell, the two of them were about to head into the forest, but their two friends, Char and Phil, found out about their plan and insisted on joining them. Mon told them that while he was at the library, he saw a fairy, which was believed to have a connection with alchemy. Upon reaching the forest, they were suddenly ambushed by British soldiers. Rich immediately fought back. Seeing this, Mon wanted to help, but due to his weak physique, he was easily defeated. As they were cornered, Mon quickly unleashed one of his creations, a smoke bomb. Char, witnessing this, accused Mon of being a dark sorcerer who wielded forbidden magic. Mon then took out a vial and declared that he could turn Phil into an immortal and powerful being. Seeing this, Phil pretended to be possessed by a demon to scare the British soldiers surrounding them. Meanwhile, Rich, after a tough battle, managed to defeat one of the soldiers. Afterward, Rich expressed concerns about their future, given their noble backgrounds in the ongoing war. They made an oath by the riverside to remain friends no matter what. Back at the academy, the boy was challenged to a duel by a fellow student, Alan, who accused him of endangering Phil. Rich intervened, humiliating Alan for his arrogance. Shortly after, Rich informed Mon that she had to leave for the battlefield, as her family's territory was under threat. Before leaving, she shared a heartfelt moment with him, reflecting on their friendship. Desperate to protect Rich, the boy begged Nick, the old alchemist, to teach him how to use the Philosopher's Stone. Nick cryptically warned him that those who pursue immortality often face loneliness and suffering. Disheartened by what he had heard, Mon immediately set out for the battlefield in search of Rich. However, upon arriving, all he found was Rich's broken sword. Mon cried out her name in despair. That night, he experimented with the stone, accidentally summoning Asa, the queen of fairies.
Christianity existed. I implore you, be my guide! In return, I offer you my mortals!
Displeased at being summoned by a human, Asa initially refused to help him but was impressed by his determination. She revealed that the Philosopher's Stone could grant immense power but only if used correctly. The boys spent 7 years attempting to create the elixir needed to safely use the Philosopher's Stone, but he failed repeatedly. During this time, England captured Paris, forcing the French royal family to relocate. Meanwhile, a young girl named Jeanne, blessed by fairies, prayed for the war's end. Mon, who had now grown into an adult, and Asa encountered Jeanne while searching for resources in a remote village. At that moment, Mon was practicing alchemy when Jeanne, in her innocence, interrupted him as he was mixing chemicals. Suddenly, an explosion occurred, injuring Mon's back.
What could happen if the mixture is off even by a tiny bit? All-out disaster! I swear.
Asa scolded him for his carelessness. Later, Jeanne approached Mon to apologize for what had happened. Mon simply brushed it off as a minor accident, blaming himself for not being focused. Not long after, the village bell rang, signaling the arrival of a group of mercenaries. Mon and Jeanne hurried to the scene. Upon arrival, they found a woman named Hire demanding payment in exchange for protecting the village from an impending English army attack. Jeanne immediately leapt toward the woman, surprising Hire with her presence. The moment she noticed Mon, Hire instinctively shot at him, mistaking him for a sorcerer. Asa quickly intervened, explaining that Mon was an alchemist. Hire was shocked to see Asa and could hardly believe she was witnessing a fairy. Hire then revealed that she needed money, which was why she had come to the village in the first place. At that moment, a strange liquid began to drip from Mon's mouth. Asa immediately recognized it as an elixir, a side effect of the accident earlier. Mon intended to consume the philosopher's stone to gain power, but Asa stopped him, fearing the consequences. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries warned them that the English army was approaching the village. With no time to waste, they prepared to face the enemy. A mercenary handed Mon a sword for self-defense. The battle was inevitable. Hire and her troops fought desperately against the English soldiers, while Mon stood frozen, doing nothing. A villager urged him to help. Mon had an idea. He wanted to use the philosopher's stone's power, but Asa refused to take the risk, fearing the consequences. Meanwhile, Jeanne prayed for the safety of the villagers. The dwarves of the village also wanted to help defend against the invaders who intended to burn the village down. However, Jeanne sensed something was wrong. She quietly slipped away and soon discovered the lifeless bodies of the dwarves. At the same time, Mon was still arguing with Asa when he suddenly realized that Jeanne was missing. He immediately rushed after her, only to find her gravely injured. Without hesitation, he placed a fragment of the philosopher's stone into her body and kissed her, transferring the elixir from his mouth to hers. In pain as the transformation took hold. Meanwhile, Hire and her troops were completely surrounded. Just as all hope seemed lost, Jeanne suddenly appeared, now wielding incredible power. In an instant, she annihilated the English soldiers.
You girls really think you're a match for trained mercenaries? That's my sword!
So this is the power of the philosophers. If you're wise, you will fear me. I will make you weep and beg. What on earth happened to her?
Seeing this, the remaining enemy forces panicked and fled the village. Mon stopped Jeanne from chasing after them. Hire, bewildered by what had just happened, demanded an explanation from Mon. He reassured her that Jeanne was fine. However, still in her enhanced state, Jeanne suddenly challenged Hire to a duel. With her newfound speed, Jeanne effortlessly dodged Hire's gunfire. However, just as she was about to land a strike, she unexpectedly collapsed. The next morning, the village mayor and the villagers could not accept Jeanne's presence, believing that she had been possessed by a demon. She was cast out of the village. But before she could leave alone, Mon immediately invited her to come with him. In the next city, Jeanne's growing influence united the common people. Mon quickly spread the word that Jeanne was a holy maiden sent to save the nation. One night, while camping in the forest, Mon's group was ambushed by a bandit gang. In the midst of the attack, Jeanne asked Mon to activate her superpowers by kissing her. Afterward, Mon warned her that her strength would only last for a short time. Without hesitation, Jeanne swiftly eradicated the bandits with ease. The next morning, Mon planned to send a letter requesting a meeting with Princess Char, his childhood friend. However, upon hearing this, a soldier reported the information to a man who appeared furious at the mention of Mon's name. A short while later, Mon and Jeanne were escorted into the palace to meet Princess Char. However, during their journey, Mon was separated from Jeanne and immediately thrown into prison. Meanwhile, Jeanne was brought into the royal chamber, where she was met with cold stares from the gathered nobles. As she was about to meet Princess Char, she suddenly realized that the woman before her was not the real princess. Her accusation shocked the guests, as Jeanne had somehow identified the true princess. She then shouted toward a woman standing above them, believing her to be the real Princess Char. At the same time, Mon was finally reunited with Rich after so many years. Rich revealed that after the war, He had been branded a traitor for defying his superiors. He was furious at Mon for disappearing without a trace. Mon apologized and explained everything that had happened to him. Meanwhile, Jeanne and Char were having a private conversation in the princess's chamber. Jeanne recounted how she had met Mon. However, their moment was suddenly interrupted when a masked man entered through the window and attacked Jeanne. To his surprise, Jeanne had already transformed into her superhuman state. A fierce battle broke out as Jeanne fought to protect Char while launching a counterattack against the intruder. The fight did not last long, as Jeanne quickly overpowered the large man and defeated him with ease. However, as her energy reached its limit, Jeanne collapsed from exhaustion. In the darkness, another figure emerged. It was a mysterious man who appeared to be an ally of the fallen intruder. While at a bar, Hire's group received payment from the royal army, which made them ecstatic. They immediately started celebrating. However, Hire couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. Meanwhile, in Char's chamber, Jeanne was restrained and about to be harmed so they could extract the Philosopher's Stone, the source of her power. They also tried to force her into revealing the secret of the elixir's power. At the same time, inside the prison, Mon encountered his cousin, Trem, who had harbored a deep grudge against him for years. It turned out that Trem was the mastermind behind all the chaos. He planned to strike a war agreement with the envoys of the English kingdom. Asa had also been captured and was powerless to help Mon. Just as the situation seemed dire, Hire suddenly appeared as a savior and swiftly rescued Mon.
You double-crossing mercenary! We already paid you a
Attack, man! Don't let him escape!
They hurried to Char's chamber to rescue Jeanne. When they arrived, they found Jeanne weak and defenseless, being held hostage. The enemy demanded that Mon hand over the Philosopher's Stone in exchange for Jeanne's life. Without hesitation, Mon handed the stone to the man. Overcome with greed, the man swallowed the Philosopher's Stone, but its immense power was too much for his body to handle. He was unable to contain its energy and exploded. The next day, Mon met with the royal envoy that Trem had mentioned, only to discover that it was Phil, his childhood friend. After their conversation, Phil was seen speaking to the spirit of his late father, who commanded him to seize Mon's Philosopher's Stone and exact revenge on their family's behalf. Meanwhile, Jeanne had fully recovered. Char expressed her desire to obtain powers like Jeanne's, but Jeanne became furious upon hearing this because it would mean Mon had to kiss her as well. Mon quickly explained that the Philosopher's Stone was not a mere toy, its power carried immense consequences. Phil later approached them and revealed that his deceased father had also desired the power of the stone. This meant that Phil now saw himself as Mon's enemy. He bid them farewell and left. Unable to accept this, Mon ran after Phil as he was about to depart, pleading with him not to follow his father's ambitions. Phil, with tears in his eyes, suddenly kissed Mon, revealing his true intention. It was a trick to steal the elixir from Mon's mouth. Meanwhile, Char made a bold announcement before the gathered nobles, declaring that her kingdom would not submit to the English crown. Many nobles hesitated, doubting their chances. However, at that moment, Jeanne entered the Grand Hall, proudly carrying the flag of the Holy Maiden. Her presence reignited the nobles' fighting spirit, inspiring them to stand against the English forces. The next day, Rich set out to seek military support from her family. She went to meet his older brother, only to find him preoccupied with several young women, leaving Rich bewildered at what his brother had been doing all this time. However, to her disappointment, her brother refused to get involved in the conflict, leaving Rich frustrated. On his way back, Rich passed by a beggar who suddenly attempted to kidnap her. As the attacker tried to assault her, royal soldiers unexpectedly arrived and rescued him. It turned out that one of the young women Rich had seen in her brother's chamber had been secretly watching over her the whole time. She then revealed that despite his cowardice, Rich's brother deeply cared for his sibling. Meanwhile, at Char's residence, Jeanne received an old sword, an ancient emblem of Char's kingdom. However, Mon dismissed it as nothing more than a rusty relic, which angered Char. Shortly after, Trem arrived at the palace to meet Char, delivering a letter from the church. The message revealed that rumors had begun spreading among the people that Jeanne was not truly the Holy Maiden. This news caused unrest, as many now believed Jeanne to be an impostor. The letter Trem delivered was, in fact, an order demanding that Jeanne undergo a virginity test to prove her purity. Mon and the others were outraged by this request, fearing it would traumatize Jeanne. That night, a group of furious villagers, convinced that Jeanne was a fraud, gathered in protest. Mon rushed to stop the enraged crowd, hoping to prevent bloodshed. Hearing the commotion, Jeanne activated her superhuman abilities and dashed to the scene. She was horrified to find Mon beaten and bruised after being attacked by the mob. Enraged, she defiantly agreed to undergo the church's humiliating test. By the next morning, villagers and soldiers had assembled in front of the palace, rallying behind Jeanne to support her in the battle against the English army. Meanwhile, in Burgundy, Philippe donned an ancient cursed helmet, using Montmorency's elixir to transform into a dark Ulysses. As they prepared to depart for battle, they were approached by Batar, who was none other than Princess Char's younger brother. He was a representative of Alencon, the commander of the royal army, and also Rich's younger sibling. Upon meeting Mon, Alan still regarded him as weak and continued to speak sarcastically toward him. On the battlefield, Alan's troops encountered a mysterious woman who called herself Black Ulysses. Possessing powers similar to Jeanne's, this woman easily overpowered Alan in combat. Jeanne soon arrived on the battlefield and immediately engaged in battle with Black Ulysses. Mon reminded her of the time limit she had while using her superhuman abilities. With Jeanne's assistance, Alan's forces managed to push back the enemy soldiers, forcing them to retreat. Upon returning to the city, they were welcomed as heroes. That night, Asa approached Mon, who was still awake. Beside him, Jeanne was fast asleep. Asa warned Mon that Jeanne's feelings for him were growing stronger each day, and she feared that Jeanne might eventually become pregnant. Mon was left speechless, unsure of how he would provide the elixir in the future. Asa then suggested that she could cast a spell on him to suppress his attraction to the opposite sex. However, Mon refused, saying that it was only natural for such things to happen eventually. With that, Asa left him alone. The next morning, the enemy forces launched another attack on the city. Alan quickly ordered Mon and Jeanne to prepare for battle. His strategy was to target the enemy commander directly. Alan advanced into the battlefield, accompanied by Batar. Before long, the enemy commander, Glad, arrived, armed with a massive bogan. Upon seeing him, Jeanne immediately charged at Glad using her superhuman strength. However, it was all part of Glad's plan. He had lured Jeanne into close range. While in midair, Jeanne was suddenly shot by Glad's bogan, sending her flying. At that moment, Black Ulysses appeared and grabbed hold of Jeanne, restraining her. She then gave Glad the order to fire again. From a distance, Glad fired a giant arrow straight at them, piercing both of their hearts. With a cold expression, Glad approached, retrieved the embedded arrow, and crushed their hearts, ensuring their deaths. Mon was horrified by the sight before him. Alan quickly ordered a retreat, realizing that they could no longer continue the fight.